Welcome back to Ethics. I'm Tom, and today we continue our discussion of Kant's deontology. And we are actually going to talk about Chapter 1 of Kant's Groundwork for the Metaphysics of Morals. It's quite the title there, but it's pretty accurate. He thinks that what he's doing in this text is kind of grounding our moral intuitions in a way that is kind of unshakable and universal for Kant. And we're going to talk about some of the arguments he uses to motivate his view. And where we're going to end up is at his categorical imperative. Remember that Kant is a deontologist, so he views the study of ethics in terms of the study of our sense of duty and obligation. And the categorical imperative is going to be his main principle that allows us to isolate what the real duties are or what our real, genuine moral obligations are. It's something of an analog to Mill's greatest happiness principle, right? So the categorical imperative is Kant's big kind of criterion here. Now, we've already kind of outlined some of the main general ideas that Kant's going to be concerned with duty. He's going to be concerned with our doing the right thing for the right reasons. Kant's also going to think that our moral principles are a priori. They're kind of grounded in reason and conceptualization, not necessarily something we get from experience. So we have those kind of like basic ideas, and now we need to kind of look at the exact arguments that he makes, right? So the first main, claim he makes is that the only thing good without qualification is a good will. Okay, so what does this mean? Well, think about what good without qualification means. There's lots of things that we tend to think are good, but they require some kind of caveat to show why they're good. An example, cheeseburger is good. Some people think cheeseburger is good, right? But of course, that comes with the caveat that as long as you're not eating cheeseburgers, 5 times a day, right, then they're bad, right? Running is good. But of course, if you're running all day, every day, then it's not good for you. Intelligence is good. But if you're using that intelligence to do bad things, right, you're a criminal mastermind, that's not a good thing, right? And so this is kind of a hit against people like Aristotle from Kant, the people who rely on virtues and think that the virtues are what are good. And he thinks that all those virtues can be used for bad things, right? Patience, courage, all that kind of stuff can be used to just make someone better at being bad, right? And so Kant thinks what you need behind that is a good will. You need someone who has like good character behind that. And that's really the essential part, is a good will. And so he gives 3 basic arguments making the claim that only a good will is good without qualification. And the first one is that, like I mentioned, virtues can be used to do evil. Someone can be very talented or patient or whatever and be good at doing bad things. The second thing is that a person who lacks ability can still be ethical, right? So if you think that the will is not what's really important, if it's something like a consequentialist thinks, like a better person makes more people happy or something like this, right? Kant says, well, look at your moral intuitions. Think about someone who say someone got in a really bad accident and they are quadriplegic now, and they're not able to help people in the same way that they did once. Before they were, I don't know, a member of Greenpeace, and they were traveling all over and doing all kinds of outreach stuff. We don't think that now they're less of an ethical person, right? Because we think that kind of like what's important is their intentions, right? That they our sense of what a good person is has to do with their motivations, right? They still have kind of pure motivations, and so because our evaluation of that person does not change when differences in their abilities change, this gives good reason to think that actually the goodwill is kind of the essential part of evaluating that person's actions morally, right? And the third part, he says that the rational use of the will is necessary to be ethical, right? And so this is kind of a complicated idea and something that really runs deep in Kant's overall view. But basically, if you look at the views like consequentialist views and even Aristotle, they really focus on this idea of happiness as being the ultimate aim of human endeavors, right? And Kant thinks, well, actually, if happiness is our aim, pleasure of any sort, then we would be better served by not being rational, right? We'd be better served by instinct. That for an animal, there's no obstacle for an animal to seek whatever pleasure that animal wants, right? They eat when they eat, they sleep when they sleep. They just do their thing. Whereas rational beings, we think about what we're going to do and we kind of weigh the pros and cons and we try to prioritize in all different ways. And we have social considerations and all kinds of other things that really kind of make obstacles to happiness. And he thinks, well, look, if rationality, well, rationality is essential to our ethical reasoning, right? Because we tend not to ascribe responsibility to beings that are not rational. So we might ascribe responsibility to animals in some sense, but not in the robust sense that we ascribe it to adult humans. And so if that's the case, what is right or wrong is less likely to be found in this idea of happiness and more in the idea of our reasoning and how our reasoning factors into determining what we do, right? Um, and this all kind of points to this idea of a goodwill, that really what's important in our ethical evaluation is our intentions for our actions, right? What we think we should do, and acting based on what we think we should do, right? Our sense of duty, and acting, without malicious intent, and really having a genuine concern for others, and all this kind of stuff, right? Um, and to kind of further narrow the scope here, there's a distinction that we talked about in the last video, but he makes this distinction between acting in accordance with duty and acting from duty, or for the sake of duty, right? And so basically, acting in accordance with duty is doing the right thing, but for whatever reason, right? Um, and acting from duty is doing the right thing for the right reasons, right? And he gives this example of a shopkeeper, and the shopkeeper is, gives everyone a fair price. And the reason for doing so is to keep his business afloat. He wants to have a good reputation, and that's why he does this. Word would get out if he was giving people unfair prices or inflating prices for certain customers. And so, really, his motivation, his underlying motivation, is a sense of self-preservation, right? So it is kind of a refined sense of self-interest. And for Kant, he thinks really that's not the real reason why you should give everyone a fair price. You should give everyone a fair price because it's the right thing to do. Basically, you should have respect for that moral principle, right? So this all points us in the direction that we're looking at what it is to have goodwill, what it is to have the right sorts of intentions, what it is to genuinely act out of our sense of moral obligation, right? And all of this pushes us towards asking the question, well, what is the right kind of moral obligations we should have, right? What are the genuine moral principles? And this is where Kant gives us his categorical imperative, right? And the categorical imperative is I give a boiled down kind of version of it. There's actually 3 versions of it, but we're not going to go through all that in this class. We'll just go through the first formulation of it. And that formulation is that one should act only in such a way that your maxim can be made a universal law, or can be willed as a universal law. Okay, so what does this mean? Well, first of all, a maxim, excuse me, is a fancy word for policy, right? So your policy or rule of action, right? So you might have all kinds of maxims, like, if I drive between 5 and 10 miles over the speed limit always, right? Or something like this. Or I always show up on time or a little before for appointments, or whenever someone comes in my house, I always offer them a drink or whatever. We have all kinds of policies, rules, and ethical policies would factor into this, right? So you might have a personal policy that you never steal, or that you only lie if it's really going to help someone, or that kind of stuff, right? And so the idea is that we should only act based on those principles that can be universal principles, right? This is, and the way this works is that Kant thinks, looking at this, we will see pretty quickly that lots of things cannot be made universal policies. And that is from a conceptual standpoint, right? And so the best way to kind of look at this is to look at some paradigm examples of things that people tend to think are wrong, because they won't pass the categorical imperative. So he gives the example of making a false promise, right? So the policy is basically, whenever I get into trouble, I just make a promise to someone that I know I can't keep, right? So basically, you're lying here, right? I lie to get myself out of trouble. Now, think about if you make that a universal policy, meaning you make it such that everyone takes on this policy, that they just lie whenever it suits their needs. Well, if that were the case, then when you go to try to make that false promise and lie to someone, they're not going to believe you, right? And so it doesn't work as a universal policy. The very idea of lying is an idea of something that is the exception to the rule, from a conceptual standpoint, right? You can only lie if there is a presumption, kind of a universal presumption, that someone's going to be honest, right? That's how you are able to achieve the deception you want to in a lie. And so if you make it the case that everyone just lies whenever they want to, then your effectiveness of your lie doesn't really work, right? And so the point here is, remember the a priori reasoning, right? If you think through the concept of lying, you will see that it has to be the exception to the rule and not the rule itself. And once you see that, then that grounds the ethical principle that one should tell the truth and be honest, and that one ought not lie. Same thing with stealing, right? If you make a general policy that whenever you see something shiny and new, that you just take it without paying for it, then and you make that a universal policy, then that means that everyone basically takes whatever they want whenever they want to, and then that basically negates the whole idea of property, right? And if there's no presumption of property, if people don't respect other people's property, then there really is no category of stealing, right? Because stealing only really works if everyone kind of has a sense of what stuff is theirs and what stuff is not theirs, right? And then it just becomes like a free-for-all. And so again, the idea is that stealing has to be conceptualized as the exception to the rule and not the rule itself. So one thing to mention here when it comes to the categorical imperative is that this is not about, that if everyone stole, then it would be a really messed up world or something that we lived in. No, that's a consequentialist perspective, right? It's not about the consequences of what would happen if everyone stole. It's the idea that about the concept of stealing, right? Recognizing that it cannot serve as a universal policy. It just doesn't work, right? You can't steal in a world where everyone just steals whenever they want to, because then there's no category of stealing. And same thing with lying, right? Things like murder and suicide get much more complicated, but Kant has a way to factor those underneath the categorical imperative. But basically, the categorical imperative will outline most of our main intuitive moral principles, right? So it will outline that like stealing is wrong, that lying is wrong, that murder is wrong, and so on and so forth, right? And things that are good are passable through the categorical imperative. Whenever I see someone in trouble, I try to help them, right? You can make that a universal policy, and it's totally fine. And so for Kant, that's not an accident, right? That's because the categorical imperative and this idea of the universalizability of your policy is really the test of whether or not it's moral or immoral, right? And this gives us a way that moral principles are grounded a priori, prior to experience. They're grounded in reason itself, right? The concept of stealing admits that it is wrong, basically, because it can't be made a universal policy. In that concept is the idea that it is the exception to the rule, right? One thing that I do mention here to help understand why this idea of being grounded upon reason is that some people want to compare the categorical imperative to the golden rule. It is not the golden rule. The golden rule is that you should treat people the way you want to be treated, right? Now, notice the way that that's phrased is that your actions are based on the way in which you would want other people to treat you, right? And so it's based on your desires. And this is different than having your moral principles based on reason itself, right? So think about your desires can shift, right? They're subjective. They change from one person to another. And you could imagine someone who thinks the way they want to be treated by other people is like, I punch my friend because it's okay if he punches me. That's just the way I do things, right? I don't mind. I'm a tough guy or something like this, right? You can that's consistent with the golden rule. I can have all kinds of weird desires that I want to project onto other people and the way they treat me, and genuinely think that, and that's consistent with the golden rule because it's just based on your desires. In contrast, the categorical imperative is based on this idea, this test of universalizability, right? And so stealing is not universalizable, whether or not I like it or not, right? Whether or not I think it's okay or any of that kind of stuff, right? It kind of has a certain conceptual determination independently of what Kant would say is my inclinations, my sentiments about that, or my desires or anything like this. And this is really important for Kant, that the categorical imperative is not subjectively grounded, it's objectively grounded, although it is grounded in reason, right? So anyways, that's it for this unit. It's a tough thing to conceptualize, but hopefully between the videos and everything, it should become a little bit clearer. And that's it for right now. Okay.